98.7 with Ayabonga Tau. Now, let's take a quick look at the property sector in South Africa, which according to a market sizing report by the Property Sector Council, was valued to the tune of 5.8 trillion rand. And if we were to look at the role black people play in this sector, it's quite negligible. Less than 10% of real estate investment trusts are from black originated funds, and yet much of the debate on radical economic transformation in South Africa, especially as it relates to land, often focuses on rural agricultural land. But what about urban and peri-urban land? What about urban land for human settlement and commercial and other residential uses? And I'm joined now in studio to answer some of these questions by the CEO of the South African Institute of Black Property Practitioners, Vuyiswa Muchekwane. Good evening, Vuyiswa. How are you?
Good evening. I'm well, thank you. How are you?
Thank you so much for joining us. Now, Vuyiswa, we focused, as South Africans in general, and I use that very loosely, we focused on many sectors when it comes to BEE, employment equity, transformation codes, and targets. And yet we've tended to miss some of the sad numbers that are coming out of the property sector. What accounts for that? Why do you think we've sort of been really reluctant to open up that can of worms or that conversation in the property sector? Probably not as much as we've done, say, in mining or finance.
One of the main reasons why we have failed to zone in on the key issues in the property sector and the lack of transformation in the sector is, number one, a sort of misunderstanding or misalignment, perhaps, on what the sector is and what it represents.
Sure.
There's a lot of talk about land reform, you know, and about, wanting the land back and what we're going to, what happens then after we get it. But I think what's really important is for us to quantify and understand what we mean when we talk about the property sector. You mentioned the REITs, for example, and looking there just at the commercial property sector, you're looking at an industry that is worth 1.3 trillion rand as the commercial sector alone.
That's outside of residential or any other property. That's outside of residential.
That's just looking at the commercial sector. And, if we look at land as well, which is, a very hot topic and a very important topic to discuss. Just looking at land, we have, in this country, we have 123 million hectares of land that is available. 70% of that is agricultural land, so it's zoned for agriculture. But the 30%, as you've correctly pointed out, is urban land, and that equates to about 520 billion rand worth of land that sits in this urban zoned land.
So let me get this right. 70% of the land in South Africa is zoned as agricultural land.
Is zoned as agricultural.
And I'm assuming that some of that is in rural areas. And yet,
yes, of course,
if you look at the census, probably half of our population is in urban areas.
Yeah, but it's also really important to understand that many areas, Sandton at some point was a farm. So it's important for us as we think about our land policies and how we deal with land, that we need to understand that land is transient.
Yeah.
What is a farm today could be the richest square mile in Africa
yes,
in 50 years, which is what we've seen happen. So it's very important that we also look at that, but we need to understand that land and property, above everything else, it's an economic utility, and it needs to be understood as that. It's an economic utility. It's something that you can trade with. It's an asset that you can have. It's an asset you can build on, and it's something that can actively contribute to the development and growth of our economy as a whole.
Now Vuyiswa, you've argued, and coming as we are, of course, from a very messy, divided and polarized history, and of course even land relations and property relations are part and parcel of that kind of story, that a big part of how we've done property in South Africa, how we've invested in property, how we've managed property, and how we've resolved the question of land actually hasn't led to some form of thoroughgoing spatial transformation.
Yeah.
In actual effect, what you argue is that we've sort of re-entrenched and reinforced apartheid spatial planning. Can you just unpack for us what you mean by that? Probably taking a look at the not only the commercial side of it, but also residential property and human settlements more broadly.
Yeah. So, the apartheid system, and I'm not going to dwell on this for long, but I'm just pointing out that every aspect of the system reinforced the ideology of the system, which was segregation, and which was the economic advancement of one group in particular over another group. And it also reinforced an economic system, one that was based on migrant labor, where certain groups lived outside of the areas of economic opportunity and abundance, and all they did was serve as bodies, as laborers, to feed the system. Fast forward 23 years post-democracy, we still see a situation where we have a Sandton, where there's lots of high-end development, high-rise buildings coming up, new developments coming up in Midrand. I won't name names, but we know some of these mega mixed-use developments that have come up in our time. And yet still there's no regard for how we develop mixed income, mixed social development, as opposed to just mixed use development. And there's development that's happening in Soweto. And if you've been to Soweto recently, and in Soweto, we are still not looking at Soweto as an economy to say, how do we develop and plan the city, the town of Soweto in such a way that it becomes economically sustainable.
Do we still see it as a labor reserve, cheap labor reserve?
I think that, if I look at the difference between the type of thinking, so if I look at Maboneng, which is fairly new, I think they're celebrating their 10 years today.
Yeah. Maboneng
has been built as a sustainable, inclusive, fully well thought out urban development. There is housing,
there's retail space.
There's retail, there's office space, there are schools, or there are 1 or 2 schools there now. There are social, so they've thought through the roads, they've thought through the need for security. That is town planning. That's how you build for humans. But when you build for subhumans, that's when you just build rows and rows and rows of houses. But yet in the townships, we're not seeing where are the office blocks? Where are the retail spaces? And I'm not talking about those shopping centers, those mega shopping center developments, because they come up. But in those shopping center developments, there's still no local entrepreneurs or businesses in those shopping centers. So the money from that community still flows out of that community to some JSE listed company somewhere. We are not adequately developing these communities, and we talk about township economies, we talk about inclusive growth, but underneath all of that, property development and the types of people who are behind that property development, i.e. you and I, black people, we understand townships, we understand this country, and it's up to us to drive that development, and it's up to government to enable us to make that happen.
So before we get to the role of government and the role of policy, would you make the same argument for some of these new developments that have come up, more so around the West Rand or so, and I think of Cosmo City as one example, not necessarily in a township, but in terms of how it's been built? Would you say that those areas have actually been built with the same kind of spatial and planning lens
Absolutely.
that informed the apartheid planners?
So there's a whole lot of hype in our industry about the so-called missing middle, and everyone is developing these nice low-cost or mid-level cost housing developments.
Yes.
That's great. I have no problem with that. However, why are we, instead of reinventing the wheel, why don't we, whilst we are building new mega developments like Stain City,
yes.
Waterfall, there's those developments are happening. Where do the people who work in those places live? Where is the balance in terms of providing for, yes, the high-end development? Because in Europe, in the US, this is standard. In New York, you've got rent-controlled buildings, in premium areas, so that you can have a good mix of social classes that are incorporated in the town and its planning.
And you have the opposite of what is a gentrifying influence that we see in the inner city.
In South Africa, it's the exact opposite. We say put the poor people there, put the middle income there, and let's put the rich there. And the rich build further and further north, the poor get further and further south and west, and then we want to talk about inclusive growth. There's nothing inclusive.
Let's take a pour out in Randfontein. When we come back, I want us to unpack the policy conversation slightly. And also, I want to get a sense of what it is that you guys as the black property practitioners are actually doing to address some of these issues that we've raised. Paul, in Randfontein, Kunjan.
My brother, how are you?
Good, thanks. How are you, my leader?
I'm fine, man. I think the lady, she's correct in ways that she's raising issues about how space can be economic. But I think one thing that we should raise that there's been some government consciousness that you do need to, if you want to occupy space and make it workable, you do need to take what you have just said about a mixed economy, mixed people coming together for those with different incomes and work together to make the city viable. And for me, what is important is the issue that she's raising. I mean, there's in the urbanizing societies, a lot of more than 60% of people in the urban are going to be located in cities. So there's a need to see how cities can help build. So the planning is important. But those who are involved in property development, I don't think must see themselves outside government. They must join hands to see to it that we work together to build a better cities that are sustainable, green, and ensure that we all can live together into a same space. So Maboneng is a classical example of what you mean to recreate. But I think that the one thing that is also very important for them to appreciate is that the sustainability of cities is important.
Yes.
We don't have just have a manufacturing that occupies the whole space, and before you know it, the whole city is dense, but the population is the hazard of environmental hazards are everywhere. So I think that's important to us.
Thanks a lot, Mpo. Point well made there. Mpo out in Randfontein. But before we get the Vuyiswa's response to Mpo's question, let's quickly check out what's happening on the roads. And when we come back, I'll take you, Carl. I see you out in Alberton, and we'll get some concluding remarks and also some of the policy conversation from Vuyiswa, who's the CEO of the South African Institute for Black Property Practitioners. But before we do that, let's quickly check in with what's happening on the roads. And Jadine Tager is standing by with some power traffic.
Power traffic.
Thanks, Ayabonga. If you're traveling in Kempton Park, heavy delays on the R24 eastbound. There's an accident after Barber Road with queuing traffic from Edenvale. On the N3 South, an earlier stationary vehicle near Van Buren Road in the Bedford View area has been cleared, but there are delays on that highway back to Limbro Park. Also delays on the N12 westbound due to an earlier truck accident after the Edenvale off-ramp. Heavy delays from Craft Road. That's causing major delays if you are traveling towards Gululi's Interchange. If you're in Morningside, there's been an accident on Rivonia Road near Hill Road, particularly affecting traffic if you are traveling northbound, but also quite slow-moving traveling southbound as well on Rivonia Road. Traffic lights are not working in Fourways at Cedar and Fourways Boulevard, also at Cedar and Witkoppen. Do expect delays there. And over in Tshwane, traffic looking good. No confirmed incidents at the moment. Traffic lights